My name is Bridgette Lang. I'm a senior in Kilachand studying international relations, and my thesis is titled Countering the Far Right and Promoting Integration in Germany Through Public Messaging During the Syrian and Ukrainian Refugee Crises. So to start my presentation, let's look back to 2015. And as borders shut down in neighboring countries in 2015, German Chancellor Angela Merkel suspended common European asylum system rules, which resulted in the inflow of nearly 1 million refugees from Syria to Germany. And this elicited a lot of strong reactions, including Henry Kissinger, who is a well-known IR scholar, who said, "To shelter one refugee is a humanitarian act, but to allow 1 million strangers in is to endanger German civilization." And statements like this one, in combination with domestic political struggles with the far right, led me to wonder how exactly Germany came together as a nation to provide assistance to nearly 2 million refugees today, and what types of political narratives developed from overcoming these challenges. And my thesis addressed this question: how have public opinion and public policy become mutually reinforcing through the government's public diplomacy efforts? And furthermore, can political leaders influence the debate through the kinds of words and messages they use? I wanted to start off with some history, and I was very fortunate enough to receive funding from Kilachand to travel to Berlin, Germany, and that's where I really uncovered and realized the importance of the history. And I think we're all familiar with the Holocaust, but one thing that I wasn't familiar with previously to visiting the Documentation Center and Museum of Migration in Berlin was the fact that there were expellees who came to Germany from other countries. 12 million Germans were exiled from former German territory after World War II, returned to Germany, and another 4 million did so after 1950. And this gives Germany as a country the foundation to understand the long-term impacts of migration, but also the personal stories that affected their friends, families, and neighbors. Next, moving on to post-World War II, we have economic workers, and integration was not a top priority during this time, as people were seen as temporary workers who were coming in, working for a while, and leaving. And then my thesis kind of starts in 2011 with the Syrian conflict, but we really start seeing migrants coming into Europe in 2015. And when this happened, countries like Germany threatened to shut down their borders, leaving people displaced and without assistance that they needed to survive. Angela Merkel responds, as I mentioned before, by suspending EU laws, and the first country that refugees enter is supposed to have the responsibility, but Germany takes on this additional responsibility of allowing anyone to come into their country, no matter what country they first entered. And in 2022, we found another challenge. As of October 2022, the number of refugees in Germany has jumped to 2.2 million in light of the war in Ukraine. And so I started off my literature review wondering what types of narratives is the government combating? And I started doing this by studying two groups in Germany, which is AfD, which stands Alternative for Germany, which is a political party, and then Bridgette, which is Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West, which is a social movement. And through studying these two parties, I found lots of commonalities in the types of language that they were using to describe refugees and migrants. And they commonly framed their narrative around this Islamization and framed this kind of as an identity issue in which they claimed that they were concerned about language and culture being override by the introduction of a new religion. But in reality, it's more than religion. It's about the people who bring the religion with them, and it involves ethnicity and race, which through my literature review, I revealed is very, I guess, associated with white nationalism and also ethno-nationalism. And so what became of primary interest to me is how this verbal violence can translate into physical violence, including examples of protests that have become violent from the type of language that politicians use. So my methodology focused on public diplomacy and public messaging, and several studies that I examined during my literature review looked at public perception, media coverage, rhetoric, and other factors in relation to the refugee crisis in 2015. But none of these studies conceptualize the refugee crisis and the government reaction in 2015 or now as a public diplomacy battle over public narrative. And so my study aims to answer this question through the lens of public diplomacy. And throughout my research, I added on public messaging as well to communicate to a national audience, as I realized that there were many overlaps between the two. So breaking down my study design, I looked at listening, methods, messages, and intended audience. And so my findings section included a mixed media campaign in which I looked at speeches, posters, digital resources, and videos. And today I would like to focus on the posters. We have a big screen, so might as well put them up. And I wanted to look at the visual products from both the Ukrainian and Syrian refugee crises. And so in this first example, they're off to the one side, the yellow poster. We have an example from the Syrian refugee crisis, and then the one closer to me is from more recent, from the Ukrainian refugee crisis. And I found a few interesting observations. Both of these posters have the same goal of navigating refugees to these resources. As you can see, there's like a QR code on both of them. There's a website that you can access. But the one thing that I found really interesting is that it addresses the main concerns of voters, which is integration. The poster off to this side addresses integration. And as you can very clearly see, the mention of integration is not only for refugees, but also to show where government funding and efforts are going. Second, we have these two products that look at that are focused on youth audiences. Off to the bottom, we have this worksheet for like a youth audience in a classroom for younger kids. And then we also have at the top a Instagram post from the government. And the one thing I would like to focus on with this Instagram post, as you guys can see, if you're familiar with social media, this breaks a lot of best practice rules that I've observed in other social media. The image is distorted, there's a white line at the bottom, it's gray, it's just not very visually exciting. But most of all, it doesn't focus on refugee voices and instead focuses on leadership, so we don't see what's being done on the ground and how people are reacting towards it. And so in my discussion section, I was able to look at successes and failures. And some of the successes in this campaign are drawing on a shared past, which I was really able to observe through my visit to Germany. There's also strong messaging on integration, as we saw on the posters to the side, which addresses the main concerns of voters. And then finally, some of the products address multiple audiences, including a domestic audience and an incoming audience of refugees, about what resources are available and what the government is hoping to do. As far as failures, the one thing that I gained from my visiting Berlin, which I was able to take a tour and called Refugee Voices, and I was able to talk to a refugee who described work and education being some of the main areas that weren't being addressed by the government. And then finally, as we saw before with social media and youth messaging is a big focus, but social media fails in a lot of areas of best practice. And so to end this, I just want to say that I had a very interesting interview, and I learned from the spokesperson from UNHCR Berlin that elections can't be won on the back of refugees. And so this was important to me, knowing that the parties that did focus on refugees and promoted far-right rhetoric ultimately became less popular in the end, and so I saw this as a success in the government's campaign. But at the end of this all, I saw that refugees themselves will bear the brunt of Germany's shortfall in public messaging and will ultimately feel the deepest effect of these gaps. And so in the end, there's a really strong need for a public diplomacy campaign that spans years and not just months. And so thank you so much for listening, and thank you to all the people who helped me along in my journey. I'll turn it over to questions.
All right, do we have any questions?
Hi, thank you for this. I'm wondering, why aren't work and education part of integration resources, right?
Yeah. So from what I studied, that integration and especially language learning is a primary concern to German voters. And so although this is an area that should be emphasized upon and refugees are very concerned about, it's not something that necessarily voters are concerned about. But I think that if the German government spent time making that connection about how work and education really fit into integration, that integration is more about language learning and knowing the culture, that it could become an area of more importance and overlap in addressing both sides of the campaign.
Hi, congratulations on a great presentation. I was wondering if you could talk more about the difference in response to the Ukrainian refugee crisis. Obviously, it being more recent, with less immediately there, but especially in the context of your discussion of ethno-nationalism in the response to these crises.
Yeah, so during my interview with the UNHCR spokesperson, Chris Meltzer, he did draw some really interesting comparisons that I didn't see before that I guess at the same time, as important as they were, also kind of drew back my perspective of what nationalism looks like. And the one interesting thing that he said was that essentially during the Syrian refugee crisis, this had never been dealt with before. And then during the Ukrainian refugee crisis, that towns were more prepared to respond. And so I think that is one of the differences in the responses between the two. But I think it's pretty clear that the government is also trying to address a product that I didn't bring up previously, was a video that addressed like ethno-nationalism within Germany through German public broadcasting. And so I found that to be really interesting that the government is trying to address that. But obviously, I think there is like a lot more work to be done in that area, but it's the start to a conversation.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
No one else has a question. How do you see the work that you've done here porting over to how we might understand the sort of messaging we might do in the United States?
Yeah, that was one of the reasons why I was really interested in studying Germany, because of the successes in their campaign and also the success that they had in integrating more than 2 million refugees today. I think one of the things is focusing on like the things that we share. For Germany, it is the shared past that they have of welcoming migrants. But I think in the United States, that should be emphasized about shared culture and how like the United States looks like today. It's really like a melting pot. And so I think some of those the aspects of Germany's campaign really could be transferred over alongside addressing the main concerns of voters, which the German campaign does do by talking about integration.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're going to move to a transition period.